One phone call. That's all it took. One quiet, desperate phone call, and when Miranda Lambert heard about it, she reportedly said 5 words that ended the conversation before it even began. Not angry. Not bitter. Just devastating in their simplicity. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why those words prove she was right about him all along, because this isn't really about a phone call. It's about a pattern. A pattern that's followed Blake Shelton for more than a decade. One that people ignored when the love stories were loud and the fairy tales were convenient. A pattern that only becomes obvious once the shine wears off, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Back in 2015, Blake thought Miranda had simply gone back to Austin. He thought life would move on quietly. But what actually happened that year set off a chain reaction that's still unfolding right now. Careers shifted. Loyalties were tested. Entire friendships vanished overnight. And one woman was left to carry the blame while everyone else celebrated a brand new love story. Today, nearly 10 years later, the past Blake tried to bury is suddenly calling him back, and this time, the people on the other end of the line are listening very carefully. What they're hearing isn't an apology. It isn't growth. It's something far more revealing. And before we get to the 5 words Miranda allegedly said when she found out, you need to understand what led up to that moment. Because this story doesn't start with heartbreak. It starts with perfection and the quiet cracks no one wanted to see. In 2015, Blake Shelton and Miranda Lambert weren't just married. They were the couple. Country music royalty. The kind of pairing that felt untouchable. Awards stacked up. Sold-out tours. Red carpets where every camera followed their every move. When they sang together, it felt electric. When they laughed together, it felt real. Fans didn't just admire their relationship, they believed in it. That's why what happened next felt unreal. There was no long, messy public unraveling. No months of warning signs for fans to dissect. One moment, they were everything Nashville loved to celebrate. The next, Blake was filing for divorce. Fast, clean, almost surgical. The statement they released talked about privacy and compassion. About being real people with real lives. Polite, respectful, carefully worded. But behind that statement, according to those close to the situation, things were anything but calm, because this wasn't a slow drift apart. It was a sudden collapse. Like a truck driving straight off a cliff with no brakes. Friends were blindsided. Collaborators were confused. Even people in their inner circle didn't see it coming the way it came. And almost immediately, the narrative started forming quietly at first, then louder with every passing week. Blake moved forward. Publicly. Confidently. Miranda stayed quiet. And in Nashville, silence doesn't stay neutral for long. And that's where the story really starts to turn, because what Blake did after the divorce mattered far more than the divorce itself. When the divorce papers were signed, Blake Shelton didn't just walk away from his wife. He walked away from an entire life. Almost overnight, he disappeared from the world he and Miranda had built together. Nashville wasn't just a place they lived, it was their community. Their people. And suddenly, Blake was gone from all of it. The phone stopped ringing. The group dinners ended. Longtime friends noticed something unsettling. Blake wasn't just taking space. He was cutting ties. People who had been at their wedding. People who had toured with them, written with them, laughed with them. Years of shared history erased without explanation. No closure. No goodbye. And in a town like Nashville, that kind of exit doesn't go unnoticed. Because when someone leaves that abruptly, everyone left behind feels it. Friends weren't given clarity. They were given a choice. Stay close to Miranda or follow Blake into his new world. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people followed the spotlight. Blake had the bigger platform. The louder future. the shiny promise of Hollywood and primetime television. He had the voice, the industry power, and soon enough, a new relationship everyone wanted access to. Picking sides didn't feel like betrayal to some, it felt like survival. Meanwhile, Miranda stayed. She didn't leave town. She didn't rewrite her past. She kept showing up in the same circles, walking into rooms where half the faces now felt unfamiliar. People she once trusted became distant. Others avoided eye contact entirely. The community she helped build was suddenly fractured, and while Blake was starting fresh, Miranda was left standing in the aftermath, forced to watch her life quietly rearrange itself around someone else's choices. But the hardest part wasn't the silence. It was what that silence allowed others to assume. And that assumption would soon turn into a narrative she never agreed to, but had to live with anyway. It didn't take long for the story to flip, once Blake moved on. The questions needed answers, and when people don't have facts, they create versions that feel convenient. Almost overnight, Miranda went from being half of country music's favorite couple to being framed as the problem. The difficult one. The cold one. The reason it all fell apart. Tabloids didn't need proof. They needed contrast. Blake was smiling again. Laughing on television. Appearing lighter, freer, reborn. And standing beside him was Gwen Stefania, global superstar with a carefully polished image and a fan base that stretched far beyond country music. The optics were impossible to ignore. A new love story had arrived, and the old one needed a villain. So Miranda became that villain by default. Every headline cut a little deeper. While Blake and Gwen were holding hands in public and locking eyes on national television, Miranda was watching it all unfold from the sidelines. Not in private, not quietly, but in full view of the world. Every scroll on her phone became a reminder that her marriage wasn't just over. It had been replaced, and the humiliation didn't stop there. Friends she once confided in were suddenly sitting at Gwen's table. People who knew Miranda's personal struggles were now protecting someone else's. Her circle didn't just shrink, it inverted. The life she built was absorbed into a new one that didn't include her. The most painful part? She never received an apology. Not publicly. Not privately. No acknowledgement of the loss, the fallout, or the damage done. The narrative moved forward without her consent, and she was expected to accept it with grace. And she did. She didn't clap back. She didn't correct the record. She didn't play the same publicity game. She swallowed it, stood up, and kept moving, because breaking down would have only fed the story everyone wanted to believe. But while Miranda was being painted into a corner, Blake was stepping into something new. Something shinier. Something louder. And for a while, it looked like he'd won. But that version of the story didn't last forever, for a long time. It looked like Blake Shelton had landed exactly where he was meant to be. The scrappy Oklahoma country star faded into the background, replaced by a smoother, funnier, television-ready version of himself. Hollywood Blake, the one who cracked jokes on primetime, mentored contestants, and walked red carpets with one of the most recognizable pop stars in the world. He didn't just move on, he leveled up. The narrative was perfect. Blake had the hit TV job, the massive paychecks, the famous wife, the blended family that looked effortless in photos. He spoke openly about loving life in a way he never had before. Had talked about being calmer, happier, more grounded. To the outside world, this wasn't just a rebound. It was a glow up. Meanwhile, Nashville Blake quietly disappeared. The bars he used to haunt, the writers' rooms where he sharpened his sound, the late nights with musicians who helped build his career, all of it became part of a past he rarely acknowledged. He didn't just leave the city, he rewrote his identity. Country grit was replaced with Hollywood polish, and for years, nobody questioned it. Why would they? The fairy tale was working. Blake and Gwen were everywhere. Award shows, interviews, television specials. Their love story became proof that sometimes things fall apart so something better can come along. That's what people wanted to believe, but fairy tales have a flaw. They only work when both people are living in the same world. And slowly, almost invisibly at first, cracks began to form. Because while Hollywood embraced Blake, there was one place that never fully left him behind. One place that remembers who you were before the cameras, before the money, before the reinvention. And that place was Nashville. And Nashville was watching. Fast forward to now. And the story around Blake Shelton sounds very different. Over the past year, rumors have been circulating quietly at first, then louder. That Blake and Gwen aren't living the picture-perfect life fans still imagine. Reports claim they've been spending more time apart than together. Different coasts. Different priorities. Different versions of what home even means anymore. Gwen reportedly thrives in the city, surrounded by movement, creativity, and noise. Blake, on the other hand, keeps retreating to Oklahoma, to the ranch, the quiet, the space. Two people. Two worlds. And according to insiders, neither one wants to fully cross over into the other's life. Those close to the situation say Blake has been feeling restless, boxed in, like he's wearing a version of himself that no longer fits. The TV chapter of his career is winding down. The constant spotlight doesn't hit the same. The stepkids he once doted on are growing up and don't need him in the same way. The life he once escaped into is starting to feel unfamiliar. This part matters, so it's important to be clear. These are rumors, speculation, whispers coming from people who claim to know what's happening behind closed doors. But the consistency of those whispers is what has people paying attention, because the story they tell isn't about cheating or explosive fights. It's about something quieter and more dangerous. Discontent. The slow realization that the upgrade came with a cost no one wanted to talk about. Blake didn't just change locations. He changed ecosystems. And now, with the excitement gone, he's left alone with a question he may have avoided for years. What if the life he chose isn't the life he actually wants? And when that thought starts creeping in, when the silence gets too loud, people like Blake tend to do something very predictable. They reach backward. And that's when the phone calls began. According to multiple rumors moving through Nashville right now, Blake Shelton didn't just sit with that discomfort. He reached for the phone. Not to issue apologies, not to make peace, and not to finally acknowledge the damage left behind. Instead, reports claim he started calling people he hadn't spoken to in nearly 10 years. Old friends, industry connections, familiar voices from a life he once abandoned without explanation. And what he allegedly said during those calls is what changed everything. Because Blake wasn't calling to reconnect, he was calling to complain. Sources claim he's been venting about his current life, about Hollywood, about feeling trapped, and most controversially, about Gwen, the same woman he left everything for, the same relationship that was once held up as proof that he made the right choice. Now, he was reportedly using Miranda's old circle as a sounding board for his frustration. Let that sink in. The people he ghosted. The people who watched Miranda lose everything. Those were the ones he allegedly chose to confide in. Not with accountability, but with self-pity. He wanted validation, sympathy, someone to agree that he wasn't the problem. And here's where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore, because this isn't the first time Blake has allegedly bonded through complaint. Reports have long suggested that his connection with Gwen began during a period where both of them were unhappy in their marriages, finding comfort in shared dissatisfaction. Venting turned into closeness. Closeness turned into something more. And now, years later, the same behavior appears to be repeating itself. Different wife. Same script. Blake doesn't seem to reach out when things are good. He reaches out when he wants to feel misunderstood, when he needs an audience for his disappointment. And that audience, this time, knew exactly who would be hurt if those words got out. Which raises the question everyone is now asking, how do you think Miranda felt when she heard about those calls? When word of Blake's phone calls made its way back to Miranda, people expected fireworks, anger, maybe even a public statement after 10 years of silence. After everything she'd endured, no one would have blamed her, but that's not what happened. According to those close to her, Miranda didn't lash out. She didn't vent. She didn't even seem surprised. The rumor is that she laughed softly. Not in a cruel way. Not in a bitter way. More like the quiet reaction of someone who had just received long overdue confirmation. Because to Miranda, this wasn't shocking. It was familiar. For years, she had carried the weight of a narrative she never agreed to. She watched her personality get labeled as the problem while the real pattern stayed hidden. And now, without her saying a word, that pattern was repeating itself in plain sight. This wasn't about Gwen. It never was. It was about a man who, according to people who know him, needs to be the victim in every version of the story. A man who burns bridges, rewrites the timeline, and then looks for sympathy once the damage is done. Miranda didn't need revenge. She didn't need to correct the record. She didn't need to relive old wounds just to prove a point. Time was doing that for her. The phone calls said everything she had stayed silent about. The same behavior. The same cycle. The same inability to take responsibility when things fall apart. And the most devastating part? Miranda didn't feel anything about it. No anger. No sadness. No satisfaction. Just indifference. Because when someone finally stops mattering, that's the real ending. But while Miranda felt nothing, there was someone else who likely felt everything. And she was just starting to hear the same whispers. In Nashville, news doesn't stay quiet for long. It's a small town dressed up as a city, and everyone knows everyone, or at least someone who knows someone. Blake's alleged phone calls didn't just reach Miranda's ears. They traveled fast, bouncing from one person to another, eventually making their way toward Gwen's circle. Imagine the position this puts Gwen Stefani in. She committed to a man who left his old life behind, blended families, moved across the country, and defended him publicly through every rumor. She invested time, emotion, and trust into a relationship that the world applauded. And now, reports claim, she's hearing that her husband has been quietly complaining about her to his ex-wife's friends, the very people who helped shape his past. Humiliation isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, creeping in through phone lines, whispered conversations, and second-hand accounts. And for Gwen, the alleged betrayal is amplified because this isn't about conflict with strangers. It's about the same circle of people who witnessed Blake leave his previous life without acknowledgement or remorse. Insiders say Gwen is furious, but not the explosive, headline-making type of furious. More like the calculated, strategic kind. The quiet fury that can shape legal strategy, influence PR, and make the people around you think twice before crossing you. According to reports, some say she's already consulting attorneys, while others suggest she's waiting to see how the situation plays out publicly. What's clear, at least from the rumors, is that the Blake and Gwen story that started with glittering lights on The Voice may be entering its final chapter. And in this version, every phone call, every whispered complaint, and every old friend who shares their story becomes part of a narrative that Blake may no longer be able to control. And while all this is happening, someone else quietly steps into the picture, someone whose influence has been behind the scenes for months, potentially shaping how and when these details finally surface. Blake Shelton's world isn't just personal, it's carefully curated. Every move, every post, every public appearance is calculated. And now, according to insiders, his team is in full panic mode. The rumors about separate lives, the Oklahoma-LA divide. And these alleged phone calls aren't just gossip, they're threats to the brand they've worked years to build. The challenge is, Blake reportedly isn't listening. He believes he can fix this on his own, dialing old contacts and smoothing over his past in the hope that everything returns to the way it was. But the people whose job it is to protect him, the managers, the publicists, the strategists know something he seems to have forgotten. Once the narrative starts spreading, it rarely stops. Some insiders say the team has even considered leaking counterstories themselves. Stories that might shift blame or make Gwen look less sympathetic. But the risk is enormous. Gwen has a formidable support system, and any aggressive move could backfire spectacularly, creating public outrage instead of damage control. In this world, every picture, every post, every interview is a chess move. Blake posts a casual photo on the Oklahoma ranch, and immediately the public and media start analyzing it, staged or genuine. Gwen shares a happy family moment, and whispers begin. Is it a response, a statement, a hint at marital tension? The PR machine turns every detail into speculation, and the truth, as always, sits somewhere in the middle. And the central reality is simple. Blake made a choice in 2015. He chose Hollywood over Nashville, Gwen over Miranda, fame over familiarity. And now, almost a decade later, those choices are colliding with the past he tried to leave behind, the life he built on top of. What he destroyed is starting to show cracks. And no amount of strategic phone calls or careful PR can fully cover them. Nashville isn't just a city, it's a community that remembers. Every favor, every betrayal, every friendship built over decades leaves a mark. And when Blake left for Hollywood, he didn't just abandon Miranda. He walked away from an entire ecosystem of people who had invested in him. Songwriters who gave him their best work, producers who shaped his sound, musicians who toured for years, radio promoters who fought to get his music played. He left them all behind without acknowledgement. For 10 years, those people stayed quiet. They watched from the sidelines as Blake's Hollywood dream unfolded. They watched the awards, the fame, the big wedding with Gwen. They kept their distance, not out of malice, but out of principle. They understood that sometimes patience is the strongest response, but patience has a limit. And when Blake allegedly started making those calls, the silence began to crack. Some answered. Some listened sympathetically. Some even offered small reassurances. But almost immediately, the information spread. In Nashville, nothing stays private. Every word he said, every complaint he shared, became part of the town's collective memory. It wasn't just being told, it was being repeated, analyzed, and quietly judged. Then there were those who didn't answer. The ones who mattered most. The true friends. They let his calls go to voicemail. They avoided his attempts at reconnection. Because 10 years of silence, 10 years of choosing someone else, isn't undone by a few phone calls. The bridges burned a decade ago don't magically rebuild overnight. And just like that, Blake is learning the same lesson Miranda did back in 2015. The people you abandon, the loyalty you ignore, and the consequences you dismiss don't disappear. The river becomes impossible to cross. The echoes of your past only get louder. Nashville remembers. And this time, it's not just watching quietly, it's paying attention. Meanwhile, Miranda Lambert has built a life that doesn't hinge on anyone else's choices. She's found stability, love, and creative freedom on her own terms. Her current marriage, by all accounts, is strong, built on mutual respect and admiration. Her music continues to thrive, reflecting her personal journey and artistic vision. And her fan base? Loyal, unwavering, and appreciative of the woman who refused to be defined by someone else's story. Miranda's story isn't one of revenge. It's one of quiet triumph. She endured public humiliation, personal loss, and the erasure of her social circle, and yet she emerged stronger. She rebuilt herself, proving that life doesn't need to revolve around those who left or hurt you. She didn't need to respond publicly to Blake's alleged phone calls. She didn't need to prove him wrong, because her success, her happiness, and her peace speak volumes on their own. No anger, no bitterness, no dramatic outburst. Just calm acknowledgement. A quiet confirmation that she saw the pattern long before anyone else did. She knew the man, understood the cycle. And now the world is seeing what she always understood. Loyalty, respect, and integrity are rare, and those who fail to honor them eventually reveal themselves. Miranda doesn't need revenge. She doesn't need closure. She has already achieved the ultimate vindication, living well, on her own terms, and proving that even when a world seems to erase you, you can rise, rebuild, and become irreplaceable. And while Blake navigates the fallout of choices made nearly a decade ago, Miranda is quietly showing the one thing that matters most: strength, independence, and resilience that no phone call, rumor, or scandal can touch. So, what does all of this really mean? Blake Shelton made choices in 2015 that seemed to work in the short-term Hollywood. Fame, a new love story, but those choices carried consequences he couldn't escape. The life he built on top of what he abandoned is starting to show cracks. Phone calls that were meant to seek validation instead exposed patterns, damaged reputations, and reminded everyone that the past has a way of catching up. Meanwhile, Miranda Lambert didn't just survive. She thrived. She rebuilt her life, her career, and her happiness on her own terms. She didn't need revenge. She didn't need to prove anyone wrong. Her quiet resilience and continued success speak louder than any headline ever could. And the 5 words she reportedly said when she heard about Blake's calls? They say it all. That sounds about right. No bitterness. No theatrics. Just the calm clarity of someone who always understood the truth. A woman who saw the pattern before anyone else, weathered the storm, and emerged stronger than ever. The takeaway here isn't about Blake's mistakes or Gwen's alleged frustrations. It's about the power of patience, self-respect, and rising above the chaos. Sometimes the most satisfying ending isn't revenge, it's indifference. It's living so well that the story writes itself, and the truth becomes undeniable. Miranda Lambert is living proof that you don't need to fight to be seen. You just need to keep moving forward, and eventually, the world catches up. And that's the story, the quiet, powerful truth behind the headlines, the phone calls, and the patterns that some people never get to see coming.